Aviators! In this final part of my VKB STECS review, I'll talk about module customization and how I decided to set it up. Then Detents, including some tips on how to set them in the VKB Device Config software. I'll talk about the grip encoder configured as an axis. Then how to add a virtual button for the middle position of the flip and toggle switch. Then I'll talk about axis precision, which we will look at also with VKB Joy Tester. And finally, I'll wrap up the whole STECS review series. When it comes to module customization, 5 controller slots on the right grip are customizable with swappable modules. And with STECS Standard or Max, you have the additional modules included in the box. You can put buttons to all the places, but as you can see, all my buttons are in the accessory magazine. I prefer more control, so I use 5-way switches. You can put those to all 5 positions, either with a very comfortable rubberized pyramid head, 5 available, or with a plastic castle switch, 3 available. And then there is one 3-way switch with a rubberized cradle on it. I really like the unique feel of this one and use it mostly for air brakes in this lower position. The movement direction goes in the direction of the mounting screws of the module, so it has a different direction in different slots. I can't imagine using it comfortably in the front slots because of its height. But why would you? Cap on this one is not interchangeable, at least not easily, and I haven't tried to break mine. To maximize control options, I went for 4 5-way switches and a 3-way cradle. This gives me 2 less actions than the 5-way switch, but the cradle is so great I simply can't skip on it. I tried castle heads on the front positions instead of pyramids, but with the castle switch I had more wrong actions, typically triggering the up switch instead of pressing it. With heads it's still not perfect, but it's easier to press it in various angles of the throttle. Switchable module options, including cap options, although only 2 basic ones, are a great feature and one of the killer features of STECS. At the same time, while it is easy to swap modules, I only tried it until I was satisfied, as it requires a reset of the unit and may reshuffle the button numbers. So I customized it, and when I was happy I didn't touch it anymore. Talking about killer features, let's talk about switchable detents. With STECS Standard and Max, you will get 5 detent frames to which you can place up to 3 detent pieces. The best thing about this detent solution is that you can easily swap the detent frames, although the screw is perhaps unnecessarily long, and then switch the configuration in the throttle with this rotary while holding the button under it as well. Of course, you have to configure the detent frames first, and we will talk about it. Also, the frames are color-coded and the LED indicates what color is active. If it blinks, it means that the frame with that color has no configured detents. There are 4 L-shaped low detents called regular and 4 L-shaped high or large detents. These give you more resistance from one side than the other. Then you have 5 high and 5 low V-shaped detents and 2 W-shaped detents. L-shaped detents are much more resistant when you mount them with a step towards the full throttle, that is, when you need to overcome it with the throttle going down. This is likely because of the asymmetric action of the detent rollers. It's so hard for the higher L-shape that I'd rather avoid doing it. Not to mention it is not even practical, especially on the desk, as you will likely move the whole throttle instead. I feel like eventually I'd break the roller mechanism. Originally I used the reversed L-shaped detent for the engine stop idle action, or in FC3 for engine stop start, but later I went for the large V detent, which gives me enough resistance to avoid accidental trip over the detent and is much more comfortable to use. Each detent physically takes around 10% of the designated range of the frame, but with the roller action it's more like 15% of the total throttle range. This is not a problem for 1 detent, little problem for 2 detents, but with 3 detents, which is also the maximum number you can configure, you have hardly 50% of the throttle left, likely split into 3 or 4 areas. You can assign virtual button presses to various throttle versus detent positions, or to the transitions up or down, which is flexible enough for mapping throttle, stop, idle actions and similar. The constant button press can also be changed to a short pulse if you wish, which brings a lot of flexibility, and that's great. For this 1 greater than less than 2 setup, you may consider manual adjustment to the width percentage to make it narrower. Otherwise, going to idle above the detent may re-trigger the upper transition buttons, which may be annoying for some planes. For instance, if you bind SU25T start engine action to the transition up, you likely don't want to do it repeatedly. The transition is triggered every time the detent area is left. This is easy to check with the DNT LED indicator on the base of the throttle. It would be probably better if the actions were triggered with some hysteresis, that is, only when the middle of the detent width was crossed previously, but that's not how it works now, so narrowing the detent width is the best workaround. The drawback is that when the throttle is just above such detent, it indicates some non-zero value, so I only use it for stop idle detent and then at some dead zone in DCS. Afterburner detents are a different story. Narrowing the detent width for them is not necessary and sometimes not desirable. One wants to set it so that you don't trigger the afterburner when you are at a maximum throttle below it. You may tune the precise physical position for the AB detent forever, but it may be easier to do the final tuning in DCS with some axis curve. I fly multiple planes with an AB and I generally use the same detent frame for most of them, so I naturally use various curves in DCS instead of many frames. I have one detent with AB and start-stop detents, and another one with just AB detent and shorter afterburner area, which I use for all the jets. So those are detents, extremely flexible, configurable. They can simulate button presses either based on the position or after a transition, optionally as short pulses. What more can we want? Nitpicking really, but I'd like to see an even more subtle version of the W detent. This detent doesn't provide much resistance, which is fine, but it still takes a lot of throttle width. I don't mind when I feel the detent being in action, but the problem is that the action pushes the throttle either away or into the central position. If the W was even lower, with even gentler slope, and the middle position was even narrower, I'd gladly use it for something like a nominal power rating detent. I'm not saying it's useless, but the alternative would work just as well without taking that much of the throttle range. I don't mind the detent width for the afterburner and stop idle detent. I can easily justify it there, and overall action is still very good. Overall, the detent solution is ingenious. It's well thought out, and while it may not be an exact replica of any plane, it's very flexible for guys like me who like flying various planes. I thought I'd want some finger lifts when I started to look for a new throttle, but I don't miss them at all. STECS Detents are really very good. Now let's do some live VKB Dev Config demo in which I'll set up this horribly looking red detent frame with 3 detent pieces. Be sure to have the right device chosen. Here you go to Profile. It's strange, but first you navigate to the bottom of the software. And then you choose from one of these tabs and you choose Detents. And you choose the set with the right color. In our case, it's a red one. I will clear this set for a while. Send it to the device. Now you can see that the blinking indicates that there are no detent pieces configured. So let's do that. We will use the wizard here because it's a good starting point. We'll check what the pieces are. This is the V shape. So let's do that. V shape. It doesn't matter what the size is. Only the shape is important here. So we'll choose that one. Now we'll move under that piece and let the throttle rest so it doesn't bump back. You don't want it to move. You want it to be stable here. Good. And that's it. Now this one is not as wide as I said that it's around 15%, but you will see another one. This one is the W. Yes, we are there. Let's go from the top. Good. See, 18%, even more than I said before. So this one is the L shape. Now I'm not sure which one is switch. It's this one, Afterburner. Again, we are under it. We are above it now, but we have to be sure it doesn't, move by itself, that it's not pushed away by the detent. And this one is even wider. So as you can see, not much of the throttle is left here. It's something more than 50%. And these red areas, they cover the whole range from 0 to 100. Right now you don't see that. You can see there are 2 cursors here. One is indicating the physical position and the other one virtual position. But they go together because right now the device sends the old data we configured it, but we have to push the configuration to the device, and now we will see the difference. Now, as the real position is under the detent, it already indicates the center of the detent. And then we go above, this hardly moved. And the same repeats here. And here it's not the center but the bottom of the detent, it's just because of the shape, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is these positions here. That's what is sent when the throttle is in this position. So right now, this one is different. This is the center position, 74.8, but it sends the bottom of this detent. So it's 74.8 minus half of this one. And you may play with this. That's what this curvature column here is. For instance, you can totally eliminate this range if you say that this position is actually 0. So if you do this, send it to the device. Now you can see that nothing is happening with the red arrow, and only now it starts moving from the 0. Now, whether you set the curvature here or not, it's up to you. You can also do it in-game, but there are some applications for this. For instance, start, stop detent or the idle detent. So we set our red detent, but we didn't talk about this event. And let's talk about it in the context of this idle detent on my detent frame with idle detent and Afterburner detent. Now, for idle detent, it is also recommended to use the L-shaped detents, but the small piece, regular, it doesn't give me enough resistance I would like to have. So instead I use this V shape, the large piece is it. Definitely don't use that large L shape, because it is really difficult for these rollers to go over it in this direction, as I already probably mentioned. Now, why is it practical to have this idle detent narrower? So you can choose various events you want to send, depending on where the throttle is compared to the detent. But there is this very practical 1-2 action or 1-2 event that offers you, when you choose this one, for instance, it gives you only 2 buttons. But this one gives you 4. I'm not sure. I see when you set it, it gives you 4. I don't want it for idle detent. For Afterburner detent. So this is a very unique action that gives you 4 detent. It's 2 for each throttle. So it's one action when you go under the detent, one action when you go over the detent, when you leave the detent. So the action, the button is pressed when the detent stops being engaged, and when you go one direction or the other. And the other 2 buttons are pressed for the other throttle. Why is it cool, and why you don't want to actually engage the detent when you are just leaning on that idle detent? So one example, let's go to SU25, because here going below the detent is engine stop. Above is engine start. Now the engine start is not only having a throttle in some position, it actually presses the button and does something with the engine. So you don't want to engage it every time you go to the minimum throttle, right? And that's why we have this width a little bit narrower. Now what this causes, of course, is that when you are all the way down, you already have some minimal values sent out. And if you don't want to engage the throttle at this minimum position, it's very easy to fix it. In axis commands, you simply go to the axis tuning and set dead zone to 1 or 2. I set it to 2 just to be really sure. So when you are down, you are definitely in 0. No problem. Now let's talk about the other detent piece, which is the Afterburner. And you can see that I have it set to 75. So I use this curvature. I didn't want to mount it all the way to 75, because then I would have very little room for Afterburner, and perhaps I want to be able to, go between them. So I decided to mount the detent a little bit lower and set it manually to 75. So you can either play with the physical position or just set it here in curvature. That's what is sent when you touch the detent, and then again it starts from this 75 when you leave it. Now the 75 is not the Afterburner position for all the DCS planes. It is for F18C, which we can demonstrate in this axis tuning. You can see that it is totally linear, sans the dead zone, and at 75 out it also sends 75 in. Ignore the inversion, no problem. By the way, if you want to use the dead zone, of course you have to switch it to slider, otherwise you would have a dead zone in the middle, that's not what you want. And any curvature, of course, again you have to switch it to slider. As an example of another plane, F15, this one has the Afterburner starting at value out value 80. So while the throttle still receives or sends 75, the DCS received 75. Plane thinks that the throttle is at 80, and that's the maximum military power before the Afterburner starts. Now the curvature here is only integer, so it may not be totally precise, but you can go into the config file and even set some decimal number there, or you can of course play with the user curve, but that's much more complicated. And it's difficult to get such a nice shape, smooth shape with user curve. So that's for the example of a detent with idle, stop idle detent, and why it is practical to have it narrower in the software, for which you have to compensate with dead zone, and an example of Afterburner detent, and how you can easily tune with the curvature for various planes and the various positions of the actual Afterburner. There's one very important thing I've totally forgot to mention, it's this pulse. What this does is the button press is generated only for a short while. So whenever I leave the detent, there is like a press of the button and then it's gone. Because otherwise, without it, and that's why I forgot about it, because I never use it without it. Let's see what it does. Let's go to buttons. Be sure to have this poll checked, or you can go to test, whatever. And here you can see that some buttons are engaged all the time. When you're under it and also when you're above it. And it works all the way to the next detent, then it disengages. So the same way, if I set something similar for the next detent, it would work that the button up would go from the top of the detent all the way up, or to the next detent, and the lower one would be engaged in the same area that the up button is engaged for this detent. So perhaps it's practical for some things, but it's definitely not practical for things like throttle idle or that start engine for SU25T, as mentioned before. So be sure to use the pulse, unless you really find a very good use case for not pulsing that button, but I didn't find it. A few notes. If you're setting red detent frame, be sure to have red also on the device. Now it's blue, I'm not sure whether it's visible on the video. Every time you send the config to the device, it will check what color is here and it will switch to that set in the software. So don't be surprised when this happens. It means that you have different sets here. And of course, if you go to a red set and you check in how this behaves, it will behave definitely strangely, because now it behaves according to the blue set. So that's one thing you have to be careful about. Another thing is that the black detent, the first one, has no options to be configured. So while you can technically put detents there, by default you can't set them up. Now, there may be people who actually don't need any detent-less frame. In that case, there is an option how to override this, or how to change the configuration of this to offer detents for this black frame as well. Now, I'll keep the black setup without detents as I want it for propellers and helicopters, but actually this one works just fine as well, because if you just use it from the top of the range, top of the detent to the top of the range, it covers the whole range. You just have a little bit shorter throttle, but with this precision it's not a problem. So sometimes I don't bother to switch from white to black at all. I don't have detents on this one by default, of course. And so these are the detents. Now let's talk about these unfortunate encoders on the left grip. I like encoders, but not these and not here. Perhaps in newer planes I'll find some usage for them, but I'd much prefer a good solid axis. But with this configuration software, you can turn the encoders into axis. Let's see how, and also look at the pros and cons. So go to the button setup and check this poll here, which will show you the live data from the device. Immediately you can see the first problem with the encoders. They are a little bit laggy, but they are easy to set as axis. I have it partially already prepared because I had them as axis, but the key point is here to switch them to trimmer and choose the axis. For instance, 7. I don't know. I read 7, it's a 6, whatever. And then you choose the multiplier here. Don't confuse 1 with 1K as I did previously, and hardly see any action with it. Now 1K is not a size of the step. It is multiplied by another number somewhere else. I'm not sure exactly where. Now it's set here, and it sends the data to the axis. Let's go to axis and be sure that these axis with the number is enabled. It may be reversed as you wish. And finally, in this physical axis area, you have to use this trim plus mode. The rest, I'm not sure. It's probably just fine. Of course, you have to send the configuration to the device, and now we can test it. Let's go here, switch to, or wait for the device to initialize, and switch to axis. And then you can see that this one has reasonably precise axis. This was one I had configured already. And this is the new one with quite big steps, 4K is each step. Don't let that 1K from the configuration confuse you. Just try it and find the right value for you. With this step, when you see 4K step with a total of 64K values, you have 17 distinct positions, including the edge position for 0 or max, whatever. So you have 64 divided by 4, it's 16 plus the one end position, 17 distinct positions. But even though you have only 17 positions on some axes, you need 2 or 3 moves of the finger to cover the whole range, because how the encoder is placed and what you see from it. This one is much easier. You can ride it with your palm and you can cover the whole range with one move if you do it right. So that's why I have it set for much gentler step of 1K. And that gives me 65 different positions. That looks okay-ish, but I will demonstrate that it's still not enough for precise axis. So here we are in my trusty L39, and I use this for this downside deflection, this mirror deflection. But as you can see, I actually have it kept to 12 because the rest of the range is not important for me. And each step is quite obvious. It's not a big deal. My aiming is worse than the limitations of this. And I even have it set with some curve, so I have more values here than at the higher range here. So with some creativity and limitations and saturation and I don't know what, you can get reasonable results, but it's still not perfect. If you compare it with, for instance, a thumb wheel that has 3/4 of a circle full rotation and has here has a minimal step of 64, you're not even physically able to do that. You know, you can just barely see that it blinked there for a while, but it's single move and you can go from one end to the other, yet it is much smoother with many more possible values. So that's the difference between axis and encoder as an axis. On a final note, there's one problem with this. When it's set as axis, it doesn't work as encoder anymore. What you can do, you can use this Boolean tab to duplicate the values of duplicate the buttons. You know, so these buttons do the action, and also you will get other buttons doing the same action, and then use these two buttons and switch them to axis. But what happens is that such an axis has even higher lag than the original encoder. One good thing about the axis on the encoder is that it has no lag. So even though you see the laggy action of the encoders here, the actual axis is without any noticeable lag. So that's one benefit of this solution. But you know, you get the same with true axis, of course. There are other customizations you can do in the config software, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. There is an axis on the flip switch, on this one. All you have to do is to enable it, and it's axis number 6. But I disabled it because if we check it, and now you can see that it moves, but it's strangely off-center when it's in this middle detent. And I eventually didn't find any usage for it because I like the switch for landing gear. Some landing gear has also the neutral position. So that's how I use it. Talking about the neutral position, some of the switches have actually buttons only for up and down position, but not for the middle position. The same goes for this toggle, but if you check this test, you can see that also the center position triggers some button, and the same goes for this landing gear, and it also just sends a short pulse for it. How is it done? So we've been to this Boolean tab under this profile, or above this profile. And these are the settings that do it. So here you can actually also see it. So the logic here is it's a inverted OR. Either this one or this one is on, it would be on as well. But because it's inverted, it is on only when neither of these is on. And that's how it works. So on one, none, the other. So in the middle position, it actually creates a new virtual button. Although the virtual button is actually set as physical. I don't know exactly the details about a physical and virtual button, because obviously even on the physical layer I can create a new virtual button, which is, you know, this one. Here you can see that it actually stays there, the action, but it is set to send just a short pulse generator. And this is very practical, because if you're in a simulation, it only sends a short pulse and then it doesn't send any other signal. So for instance, if you get into the cockpit and the switch is in the wrong position, it doesn't bother you, and you can fix it through the neutral position, which mostly is harmless. You know, it's not like it will lift your gear, for instance, on the ground or something. I'm still not sure about practicality of this one, because firstly, you can also set pulses here, but it doesn't make sense, at least not to me, because when you're holding it, you want the action to actually last for whatever reason. For instance, it can be a searchlight going up or something like that. Also, another thing is that when you decide to set this for some action, like whatever, when you release it, it will change to the other button. So you have to hold it and then press OK, which is annoying, right? So I'm actually thinking about removing this middle position from these momentary switches, like this one as well. It makes a lot of sense here. The central position really should trigger some button, and it's practical. So while for momentary switches, the pulse generation is not optimal, and also the center position is probably not ideal, there's another element here, and it's this rotary, that can benefit from pulses. And you can see that I have them set as sending pulses. And again, it's the same reason. Whenever I have it in some position, I don't have to be afraid about it when I enter the cockpit. So both virtual middle position button and pulse setup has its uses, but it's less likely for momentary switches. Just, use it and don't overdo it. This video got totally out of hand with these live examples, but let's do the last one about precision of the axis. And you can check the precision of the axis either in the VKB Device Config under the Test tab, but even better, you can use the VKB joy tester that is also included with the package. So choose the right device, press start, and then you can see how smooth the main throttle axis is. And also you can see the minimum steps, although sometimes there is a wrong one indicated, which is not a typical step for some axis. In that case, you have to re-choose the device. And you can see that consistently the main throttle axis has 16. Beautiful. Also, there's absolutely no overshoot, although there's a small creep at the heavy end, at this front end of the throttle, but that's another problem. We already talked about it, and you can tighten it up to eliminate it partially at least. And after a while, it will definitely stay there. So the precision of the main axis is really excellent. Let's talk about other axes. Typically, they have precision of 64, which still delivers 1,000 of different values across the whole range, around 1,000. The same goes for this axis, but I have it disabled, so I will not show that one. And then there are, of course, encoder axes, and that's however you set them. You can set them all the way to step 1, but in that case you will probably not be able to, how many times you would have to move your finger like that. Thousands times. And finally, let's talk about this OTS, which in theory, although now it indicated 1, that's wrong. 1 is just, some rounding thing. 64 is typical value, so it has 1,000 different positions across from one end to the other, but you will not be able to use it because physically you're not able to control it like in 1,000 different positions. It's also very short for that, and the head is also not ideal. Even I experimented, this would be better as a head, much better feeling, and it has the same end, but of course it doesn't cover it from the dust, so it's not a good way. With OTS you're much more precise in this direction, forward, backwards, which I use for up, down, of course, and this one is much more difficult to control. Also, it gives me some resistance when I start, and then it's kind of going runaway, so the feeling of the OTS could be better, but it's still usable. I use OTS as TDC, and in FC3 planes the TDC has few speed steps, for which it is just fine, although I use a strange curve to get some slow action as soon as possible, which is this sharp end or steep end, and then I want very slowly to speed up the TDC. And also I have a cap on the maximum speed, because otherwise it would be very fast. And while the axis is quite short, the physical action is quite short, It's still practical also as a brake lever in planes without toe brakes, for instance L-39 or Yak-52 and some other Russian planes. It is quite usable, which is good because there is no other alternative on the throttle itself. Nothing self-centering anyway. So this is no brake, and now I'm braking more and more and more. So to wrap up the whole series and my VKB STECS experience so far, I have owned it for 7 months and I like it for the most part. During those months it has worked as advertised, and so far I didn't see any quality issues. The dual throttle itself is excellent, easy to split and reconnect, and its tension is easy to adjust. My biggest gripes are with the lack of axis on the grips. I'd love to have one more axis instead of an encoder, and also one of the front triggers could dual function as an axis, for instance for brakes. One can reconfigure an encoder as an axis, but there are some precision versus speed limitations. I got used to the thumbstick, no problem with that, although the overall feel and the head shape and especially the push action could be better. I like the standard option with the additional stem module mounted before the base. This makes the throttle a bit further when desk mounted, or on the other hand, may put some buttons uncomfortably close to when you are in the chair, but that's really nitpicking again. Stem adds some important elements: flip and trigger switches, great encoders, case switches and many buttons. Perhaps too many, and I wouldn't mind a few latched switches instead of some of those buttons. But overall, a great addition unit, good value. And then there are the killer features: switchable modules on 5 positions on the right grip, and of course the modular detents with support for flexible virtual buttons generated by various transitions. In total, this is a great throttle. It's priced reasonably, although probably not as aggressive as various Wingwing throttles, but because I can't compare it with those, I instead enjoyed this unit, especially as my irritation with the grip axis situation got weaker over time. Also, after I bought myself some serious rudder pedals, I didn't expect that duty from the throttle, which also helped. It is an excellent throttle with ingenious detent solution, and I like it. And with that, this 3-part review is finally over. Fly safe and see you later. A to som si dal na budúce, keď budem robiť, čo to je, gladiátor, tak dúfam, že to stihnem na jednu časť, alebo polovica časti by bola ešte lepšia. Toto je hotová fuška toto. Kde mám to pivo? Láska, Starcraft nejdeš zahrať?